Thank you on the Kennedy School.
You hit,
Thanks.
you hit several balls up. Packing $3.
Are you all set?
It's quiet. Okay, gentlemen. Oh, God.
He didn't understand it.
There is somebody sitting
There is
here,
somebody
right?
here, yeah, I can't tell who they are.
Tell us what the format is.
I'm gonna kick it off.
You're gonna kick it off.
Oh, do you mind to
Dick
Yes.
first.
chưa chưa ấn nhé
Yes, cái đoạn này nè. Hình ảnh.
yeah yeah
Creating a framework for peace and security. We're gonna have this and 2 additional online conferences. You didn't tell me about this part. I am very pessimistic about creating a framework other than the one we have. I'm pessimistic about creating it.
That's right.
Long. It's not gonna be done. What do you say, man?
Hi, please.
That's how we do this. He didn't brief me on why we're doing this. Gus just said, show up.
why
I knew you could do it on your feet.
Lessons.
There's gotta be enough. Hi, Ezra. Hi. How are you? Thank you for joining us. You're fine, because the first 50 minutes is going to be on Local 1, and then we're going to do... No, I don't mean in time frame. I mean your horizon in terms of this is we pick a topic for the... No. My question is...
Hello.
Talking about the next century, the next 20 years, the next 10 years. It's up to us.
Hi.
Could be any of them. And anything. Sure. But if you're talking about the next 10 years.
Hi. From Japan. Can you hear me?
I know me
Hi. She winked at us, or she did us, or...
Chỗ mình nghe được không? Okay.
so far so good
Yes. Good.
so
Yes.
yeah
It's all set.
okay Mike
Ready to go? Yes.
Ready.
everybody ready ask everybody ask I'm already I don't think they can see us yes
Ready?
Yes.
Good morning. I'm Mike Dukakis, the former governor of Massachusetts and the chair of the Boston Global Forum. And for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, just a quick word or two about the forum. This was created largely thanks to the initiative of Tuan Nguyen, who was the founder of the Internet in Vietnam, who is currently, today and these past several weeks in Vietnam, but also spends a good deal of his time here in Boston. And he and a group of us who he pulled together decided it would make a lot of sense if we could create something which we are calling the Boston Global Forum. Tap into the extraordinary intellectual horsepower and riches that we have here in the Boston area, and at the same time involve literally hundreds of you from around the globe thanks to the miracle of online conferencing. And we decided that what we would do is to pick a particular issue each year and focus on that issue. We began on the subject of occupational safety and health standards, especially after the disasters in Bangladesh, and devoted several months to that. But we've decided that for our next topic, we're going to look at the prospects for creating a framework for peace and security in the Pacific, something which I'm sure I don't have to remind any of you is a very important part of what has to be an international agenda. And we are currently at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University with some really great people who I'm going to introduce to you in just a minute. And we'll be joined by people in Japan, in Vietnam, and all over the world. We're going to begin today with a discussion of, because we're observing its 100th anniversary, whether or not there are lessons to be learned from World War I, which we can apply constructively to our efforts to create an international framework in which we can have peace and stability without war. And so we're going to spend the first 45 or 50 minutes of our session today on that. And then we're going to move, at least an introduction or a discussion on how we create a framework for peace and security in the Pacific. You know, the Greeks have an old saying, pathima mathima, it even rhymes. Things happen, we're supposed to learn from them. And so one of the things we'd like to do today in kicking off our discussion is to take a look at that with some very good people who are with me here at Kennedy School and ask ourselves whether or not there are lessons to be learned from World War I as we seek to create a peaceful and stable world. And I'm going to ask Dick Rosecrans, who was a couple of years ahead of me at Swarthmore College many years ago, and has headed up a very interesting effort recently to ask a number of people, including some of the people that are with us, to take a good look at World War I, especially its origins, and see if we can learn some lessons from that, which would be helpful to us as we move ahead now with the months and years ahead on a number of international issues, specifically for the purpose of the forum this year, the question of peace and security in the Pacific. So let me introduce Dick Rosecrans to you, and then we're going to hear from Joe Nye, Dick Cooper, and some of the other folks who are going to be discussing this, including some of the people that are involved in this and participating in this around the world. And then after 45 or 50 minutes, we're then going to get into our focus on the Pacific and at least begin that discussion. So, Dick Rosecrans, you're on.
Thanks very much, Mike, and it's wonderful to be part of this assembly and to hear the views not just of us here at Harvard, but also from around the world in Vietnam, Japan, and other places. Mike didn't mention that we have a book that has already gone to press that raises the following questions. Are we going to have a new Great War before too long, considering the ways in which World War I started? And I think if I summarize some of the views in that book, I think many of us thought that World War I, by the way, just as a parenthetical thing, it hasn't started yet. It doesn't start until 7 p.m. tonight, because that is when the House of Commons voted to impose the ultimatum on Germany for violating Belgian neutrality. So it's 7 p.m. tonight. Look at your watch.
From a British point of view. But
No,
the Germans,
no.
the Germans were already in Belgium.
Oh yeah, that's okay. I'm just talking when the British came in.
Yeah, that's from
And the British came in at 11 p.m. their time, but at 7 p.m. our time. In any event, I think many of us are convinced that with all of the nationalist and other goads to war between countries in those days, particularly the assumption that sooner or later there would be another big war. There would be nothing to eliminate war. So at some point there would have been some kind of war, but perhaps it would have been a war between two powers, not a war between 5 or 6, as it actually turned out. So I think even if we admit that there were long-run causes that would have pushed in the direction of conflict between countries because there hadn't been a major conflict since 1870-71. Still, I think that the thing that impressed most of us to the greatest degree was how accidental this war was. How there were so many ways in which it could have been avoided. And I think Joe and I will talk about some of those. But I think it is important to bear that in mind, because we look ahead. What are the reasons that might produce another war? Are they also as incidental and accidental as the reasons that helped to produce World War I? I think it is possible, and we'll get onto this later, of course, it is possible to imagine that some of the same things that caused World War I are still with us. And those are the things we begin to worry about. So I think as we look ahead, we have to think not only about what caused the war, but what you could do about what caused the war. Now, of course, if Britain hadn't come into the war, it would not have been a world war. If the person who is conducting Franz Ferdinand on that fatal day, June 28th, 1914, had not stopped at the place where he was supposed to turn and backed up in order to turn into the correct route, he wouldn't have delivered Franz Ferdinand up to Prince bullets that killed both the Archduchess Sophie and the Archduke. So that there were many sort of accidental things that could have gone the other way. Look at the degree of economic relationships between the major powers. They were very substantial. Trade between Britain and Germany was very, very significant. They were their own best trading partners despite the rivalries that they had. French and British trade was good. All of these countries could look forward to a period of economic growth ahead of them in which their own futures would look better than the past. Why didn't they then hold back or consider the military issue? The military issue. There was no certainty that the Schlieffen Plan, which involved a sweeping movement around the French forces that would go through Belgium and then circle around just by the seacoast and come back and press the French against the borders of Paris at their own frontiers. There was the possibility that this would not work. The Germans did not have enough forces to, in fact, carry it out, and that they staked everything on this rash gambit is, I think, at the time and certainly later, a very questionable thing to have done. So there were many ways in which countries went into a war that they could not see the end of. They couldn't see the end of it physically. They couldn't see the end of it in terms of the violence that it would create. At the Battle of the Somme on July 1st, 1916, that single day, more people were killed or put out of action than all of the Americans killed in Vietnam during our period of time there. So this was just a horrific bloodletting in which every few seconds people died. And I think they found out that for every meter of advance that the French or the British had against the Germans, it took 11 people to die for every meter. I mean, it was just an unbelievable killing machine. That this could not have been avoided seems, in hindsight, a very tremendous unanswered question. One which I think we will come back to and deal with in some length also. So I think we're posing for ourselves and for our listeners the whole question of what caused the war and how do we prevent it from occurring again. And I would merely offer now the cautionary tale that it is not going to be easy to do that. The kinds of conflicts that exist in East Asia now are not minor ones. They do involve territorial outposts in the East China Sea. Territory is one of the things, as we found out in the Ukraine, causes big problems between countries. So those kinds of issues have to be taken care of to be sure that everything is going to be fine in terms of our longer relations with countries in the Far East. But having offered those cautionary tales, I will defer to Joe Nye, who I think is going to speak next. Is that right?
Yep.
Well, let me pick up where Dick Rosecrans left off and relate the topic that we're discussing this August 4th to East Asia, and particularly to stability in East Asia. The place to start on this, I suppose, seeing that I'm seated next to my great friend Mike Dukakis, is with the Greek. There is a
Why not?
Why not? They got there first. There's a famous statement by Thucydides about the origins of the Peloponnesian War, which says it was caused by the rise and power of Athens and the fear it created in Sparta. Indeed, I wrote a piece in The Economist in 1998 suggesting that this was an interesting parallel. But many people say it's really the story of World War I, the rise and the power of Germany and the fear it created in Britain. In fact, that's much too simple. It was the rise and the power of Russia as well as Germany, and the decline in the power of Austria, which was just as important. So one has to be careful of these analogies, these historical analogies. While the analogy to Thucydides and the origins of the Peloponnesian War are cautionary, they really are not determinative in any sense. If you ask, is it plausible or possible that we could see a war arising in East Asia? Yes, it's always possible. Is it possible that it would be like World War I? Well, I think you have to be careful. First of all, there are some important differences. There is a rise in the power of China. It does create some fear in its neighbors, Japan, Vietnam, in the United States, and so forth. But it's also worth noticing there's a lot of exaggeration of the rise in the power of China. When China passes the United States in total GDP, which some people think could happen within the next decade, some put it even earlier on purchasing power parity, it's not equal to the United States in power. And if you look back to 1914, what's interesting is that Germany had not only passed Britain industrial strength by the year 1900, but it was pursuing a very adventuresome policy. So the British faced the decision 100 years ago today. Germany had already passed them in some senses. And the United States and China, there's much more time before China gets close to the United States in overall power, including military and soft power. And that leaves us more time to manage this relationship, not to have the sense of fear or not to succumb to an extreme sense of fear, such as we saw in the World War I example. But there are two lessons that I would learn from World War I, which we want to keep in mind today. One is the role of accident and miscalculation. When I went to East Asia, called on the prime ministers of Japan and China at the request of Secretary Clinton, as she then was, along with Steve Attlee and Rich Armitage and Jim Steinberg, it was very clear to us that neither the top leaders in Japan nor the top leaders in China wanted any sort of war. But it's also clear that war sometimes happens not because people want war, but because of miscalculations. And it's interesting if you look back at so many of the things that occurred at the origins of World War I, they really were miscalculations. You can make an argument about one or another country wanting war. I think the only country that really wanted war was Austria, which wanted to prevent its decline. I think the others, in the end, would have preferred not to have had the war. But the miscalculations that occurred meant they faced with a set of decisions on eve of the war where they felt they had no choice. We want to make sure that miscalculations don't ever get us into that sort of situation. The other lesson I learned for today for East Asia from World War I is that war is never inevitable. Sometimes people who use these analogies, like the analogy from Thucydides or the analogy from World War I, say, well, this shows that war was inevitable. Nobody could have stopped it. In fact, there's another quote from Thucydides which is even more important than the one that's often used and misused about rising power and the fear it creates. And that's a statement that Thucydides made, which I think is profoundly wise to this day, which is the belief that war is inevitable becomes one of its causes. So once we succumb to the feeling that there is bound to be a war, we start preparing for war, and our adversaries or potential adversaries see our preparations and say, aha, that proves our point, and they increase their preparations, and before you know it, you have a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think the two lessons I would learn for East Asia from World War I, build on Dick's fine start, is don't succumb to misleading analogies. Instead, beware of miscalculations and don't succumb to the belief that war is inevitable. It never is inevitable.
Thanks, Joe. Dick Cooper.
Well, I'm the economist in the group, and in this study which Dick Rosekrantz referred to, I was asked to look at the relationship between the high degree of economic interdependence in 1914, again with the historical analogy in mind. The last great period of globalization was the period from 1870, I actually dated from 1866, when that first transatlantic cable, successful one, went in, to 1914. And of course, globalization is on everyone's lips these days to describe the period of the last 30 years. So again, there's an analogy between the late 19th, early 20th century and the late 20th, early 21st century in terms of the tremendous thrust of economic intercourse, not only foreign trade, but also movement of capital, and especially in the earlier period, movement of people, although the movement of people is very great today also. And the question that's often posed is how, with this high degree of interdependence, war could have taken place. Joe has given part of the answer, which is that nobody planned for it. And I just want to say with respect to Austria, Austria did not want a world war or a European-wide war. It wanted war against Serbia, a small neighbor. It wanted to punish what it considered an impudent neighbor. And it was as much surprise to the Austrians as to everyone else that a world war emerged from their initial actions. And it is absolutely true, as Dick has said, that there was a high degree of interdependence, particularly between Britain and Germany. And so the question is, why did they go to war? I want to rehabilitate a man called Norman Angell here. Many of you may never have heard of him, but those who are international relations specialists probably have. He is frequently quoted, usually with a degree of contempt, as saying in that period, 1910, war was inconceivable. That is actually not what he said at all. What he said was, my words, not his, war would be stupid. And he meant concretely by that even the victors of such a war, which was already being talked about then, would be worse off after the war than they were before. And this is in contrast to many previous wars where the victors could possibly expect to gain from war. And I mention this, a bit of intellectual history, because it's an example in my mind of truth through repetition. There's no doubt in my mind that many of the people who cite Norman Angell, as I say with a slight tone of contempt, have never read him. He did not say war was inconceivable. He said it would be stupid, and of course in that respect he was absolutely right. The victors, France and Britain, came out of World War I devastated and never, in some sense, never fully covered that. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that those who pine for a multipolar world should think twice. This, after all, was a multipolar war in world in 1914. 5 acknowledged great powers, the Ottoman Empire in decline, the young United States in a rise, and even Italy was very feisty. So this was very much a multipolar war, and look what it got us. Think carefully, those who pine for multipolar war. What don't, as a famous Chinese curse, may your wishes be granted. There was one of the great powers, Angel notwithstanding, who plausibly could persuade itself that if victorious in a European-wide war, it would actually come out ahead. And that was Russia, Tsarist Russia. This was before the Communist Revolution. And the Russian degree of economic independence was an order of magnitude lower than that of the Western European countries, Germany, France, Britain, very much lower. And Russia, over decades, even centuries, had its eye on Istanbul and an exit from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and ultimately to the Atlantic Ocean. And the Russians could persuade themselves that if they were victorious against Germany and Austria, Istanbul could fall into their hands. And that was an integral part of Russian thinking leading up to the World War. And it is noteworthy, at least on my reading of the history, that the country that first made the decision knowing that a European-wide war would follow was Russia. Germany is very culpable in many, many ways, but actually, just in terms of the time sequence, the country that made the decision knowing that war would follow, a European-wide war would follow, was actually Russia, not Germany. I'm one of those who shares the view of Joe. I'll put it even more strongly. Beware lessons of history. You run the risk of learning the wrong lesson, which the Germans did. They thought they could defeat France very quickly and then turn their military attention to Russia. So they attacked France first, and that was on the basis of their reading of the 1871 event in which they attacked France and the French capitulated very quickly. They thought that could bring that off again. Nothing could have been more wrong, as it turned out. But I think that history can stimulate the imagination, and with that in mind, my lesson is beware third countries. It was Russian action through a sequence of events that brought Britain to war with Germany. Germany played a culpable role in that. If one thinks today, as Joe suggested about China and the United States, don't just look at China and the United States. Look at what third parties who may be skillful in manipulating public and even leader sentiment in those two great countries might think they could gain from a conflict between China and the United States. And I leave it to your imagination who those countries might be. But there are at least half a dozen around the world today who might persuade themselves, given the difficulties they're in, that ginning up a little conflict would not be bad from their point of view.
Thanks, Dick. I'd like, I think, now to go to Tuan Nguyen in Vietnam, who, after all, is the guy that brought us all together around the idea of the forum. And ask him first to say hello, and secondly, perhaps to introduce some of the people that are with him in Vietnam, and ask them to make a comment or two at least. We'll come back to, obviously, when we talk in great detail about what should happen in the Pacific. So, Tuan, welcome. We miss you here in Boston, but it's good to see you, thanks to modern technology, in Vietnam.
Anh Hiền. Theo anh Hiền xem.
Did he hear you?
Để chị giới thiệu. Hello, good morning, everyone. And actually, that is good evening in Vietnam. So I'm so pleased to introduce Mr. Bùi Đức Lại. He is a special advisor to the chairman of the National Assembly in Vietnam, and he would like to say something to contribute to this session today.
Trước hết tôi xin cảm ơn ông Chủ tịch tạo điều kiện cho tôi phát biểu một số vấn đề xung quanh cái chủ đề này, và cũng xin thành thật xin lỗi quý vị là tôi không nói trực tiếp được bằng tiếng Anh và phải nhờ bạn Việt Lâm sẽ phiên dịch, và tôi sẽ tự giác rút ngắn cái bài nói chuyện lại để trừ bớt thời gian phiên dịch đó.
Governor Michael Dukakis, distinguished guests, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Chairman Dukakis for giving me a unique chance to contribute to this very important session. And I'm sorry that I cannot speak directly in English, and I have to speak in Vietnamese, and Ms. Lâm will translate for me. So I will shorten my presentation.
Chúng ta đều biết rằng thế kỷ thứ 20 là một thế kỷ chiến tranh, nhưng mà bước sang thế kỷ thứ 21 ấy, thì những năm đầu thế kỷ cũng không dự báo một tương lai tốt hơn.
As we all know that the 20th century has witnessed great wars among powers, but in the first 10 and 20 years of 21st century, we can have a perception that the world today are not safe.
Thế giới hiện nay ấy, thì đã trở nên kém an toàn hơn về nhiều mặt, và các xung đột ấy, thì ngày càng gay gắt hơn, và nhiều cái cuộc chiến đã diễn ra trên các lục địa, và các nước ấy, thì lao vào một cuộc chạy đua vũ trang mới.
Yeah, so what we see today, we see that the world has become dangerous with bloody conflicts and civil wars and armed races among countries that have taken place in many areas in the world. And additionally, there have been more troubled spots which threaten to escalate into military conflicts.
Nguy cơ bùng phát những lò lửa chiến tranh ấy, thì tôi cho rằng ngày càng nhiều hơn và càng khó dự đoán hơn. Một trong những nguyên nhân của tình hình này đấy là một số cường quốc ấy, trở nên đặc biệt hung hãn, theo đuổi những mục tiêu thay đổi trật tự thế giới và các mối quan hệ thế giới bằng mọi thủ đoạn, và khi có thể được thì họ sẵn sàng áp dụng những thủ đoạn vũ lực.
I think one origin of such chaotic situation could be blamed for the rise of certain powers, which have become more aggressive and assertive in seeking to shape the world according to its national interests and to create the new world order and rules in which they are willing to use force and coercive measures against other countries.
Việc chiếm đoạt cái Crimea trước thanh thiên bạch nhật, trước con mắt của toàn thế giới, và cuộc chiến tranh hiện đang diễn ra ở miền đông Ukraine là một bằng chứng mà có lẽ quý vị cũng đều thống nhất với tôi, là một bằng chứng rất thuyết phục của tình trạng này.
So the annexation of Crimea and current war in eastern Ukraine illustrate the feature of the Stalinism nowadays.
Ở đây tôi cũng xin phép được dành một thời gian nói kỹ hơn một chút về sự trỗi dậy không hòa bình của Trung Hoa.
But today I would like to speak more about the unpeaceful rise of China, which has been a topic of controversy.
Trung Hoa xác định mục tiêu trỗi dậy của mình rất rõ ràng là để theo đuổi giấc mộng Trung Hoa, tức là thực hiện tham vọng ngàn đời, là giành lấy vị trí thiên triều thống trị thế giới.
So the Chinese leaders always talk about peaceful rise. Their behavior in reality demonstrates the opposite thing.
Vì vậy,
To realize the Chinese dream, which in fact is to realize the centennial Chinese ambition to achieve global dominance.
Vì vậy họ nuôi dưỡng chủ nghĩa dân tộc Đại Hán, không ngừng nhắc đến những vùng đất, vùng biển lịch sử của họ trong quá khứ về vinh quang và những nỗi hận thù trong tương lai trong quá khứ.
So what we observe that the Chinese leaders have set up radical nationalism among their people through launching massive propaganda campaigns of so-called historic lands and historic waters, the Chinese glorious past and hatred relations with other regional countries.
Dường như đã thành thông lệ trong mọi quan hệ với Trung Hoa, các nước phải cam kết ủng hộ các chính sách của họ trong vấn đề Đài Loan, trong vấn đề Tây Tạng, trong vấn đề Tân Cương, trong quan hệ với các phe phái và các cá nhân đối lập ở Trung Hoa, nếu không muốn bị nước này trả đũa.
So in relations with China, every country have to make a commitment to support their policies in Taiwan, Tibet, and Uyghur issue. And in relationship with the dissidents, if not, these countries will be retaliated.
Trung Hoa ngang nhiên vạch ra một cái đường lưỡi bò chiếm hầu hết Biển Đông mà chắc các vị đều biết tính phi lý của nó.
So recently we see China declare the ninth deadline that comprises almost the South China Sea, which violates any international norms.
Vừa qua họ ngang nhiên đưa giàn khoan HD 981 vào sâu trong thềm lục địa và vùng đặc quyền kinh tế của Việt Nam với một lực lượng yểm trợ hùng hậu về quân sự, bất chấp công ước về luật biển.
So more dangerously, 2 months ago, China placed an oil inside Vietnam exclusive economic zones and using hundreds of military and paramilitary vessels with the support of fighter jets to coerce the Vietnamese civilian forces and fishermen.
Bất chấp cái thỏa thuận với các nước ASEAN và các thỏa thuận với lãnh đạo Việt Nam về việc giải quyết hòa bình các tranh chấp giữa hai nước. Nghĩa là để thực hiện cái tham vọng về đường lưỡi bò này đấy, thì Trung Hoa thực tế là sẽ bỏ những hiệp định mà Trung Hoa đã cam kết với thế giới và với các nước khác.
So the major concern is that China is no hesitant in violating the UN clause and other commitments it made with ASEAN countries and even in bilateral agreement with Vietnam.
Chúng tôi nói về hai hiện tượng cơm và vấn đề Biển Đông ấy, là để đi tới một kết luận rằng nếu thế giới vẫn không chia sẻ với nhau một cái nhìn chung và có hành động chung để ngăn chặn và trừng phạt việc dùng vũ lực cường quyền ức hiếp các nước nhỏ, thì không có gì đảm bảo rằng những tai ương của thế kỷ 20 không bị lặp lại.
So I mentioned Crimea and the South China Sea to stress that it's high time the world achieves a mutually shared perspective and joint response to deter and punish the use of force in international relations. Otherwise, there is no guarantee that the catastrophe we witnessed in the 20th century would not reiterate.
Có lẽ các vị cũng đồng ý với tôi ấy, là phải tổ chức các công việc hành động để thực hiện theo hướng là ngăn chặn cái sự sử dụng cường quyền, vũ lực để ức hiếp các nước nhỏ.
So following are some recommendations I would like to make so as to deter and prevent the bullying of small countries.
Cho nên việc cái đầu tiên ấy mà quan trọng chúng tôi tán thành ấy là cần thiết phải xây dựng các quy phạm luật pháp quốc tế về các hành xử giữa các quốc gia trong thế kỷ này.
So first of all, we agree that it's important to build up a framework to manage the tensions and particularly the international laws.
Ngăn chặn việc các nước lớn sử dụng vũ lực để ức hiếp các nước nhỏ.
These rules and norms must be effective in preventing the great powers in coercing and bullying small and medium countries.
Cần thiết phải vạch ra một cái ranh giới mà trong đó các nước không được phép vi phạm. Vượt qua ranh giới đó thì lương tâm của loài người và các lực lượng trên thế giới phải lên tiếng.
So I think that is we need to carve out a red border in which no country can violate those things. If they pass the red border, they must be punished.
Ví dụ như cái đường lưỡi bò là một cái loại ranh giới như vậy. Nếu như mà thế giới chấp nhận đường lưỡi bò của Trung Hoa thì không thể được.
So, in my opinion, the nice dash line is a kind of red border, and if the world accepts the nice dash line, it could be very dangerous for the world peace and security.
Thứ hai là các quốc gia phải có nhận thức chung và hành động chung dựa trên luật chơi chung trong các mối quan hệ quốc tế. Cần có các công cụ về chính trị, kinh tế và cả sức mạnh để đảm bảo cho việc chấp hành luật chơi chung đó.
And secondly, all nations must discuss and reach an agreement to have a shared perception and joint action that based on mutual rules in international relations. It is essential to have a political, economic, and even military instruments to ensure the enforcement of these rules.
Mỹ và các nước lớn khác có vai trò rất quan trọng trong việc đảm bảo chức năng này. Với tư cách là một siêu cường mạnh nhất, nước Mỹ có lợi ích lâu dài và cơ bản trong việc từ bỏ cách ứng xử sử dụng cường quyền và chống lại chính sách cường quyền của các quốc gia khác.
So to this end, the United States and other powers must play the leading role. Particularly, the United States, as a fully superpower, has core and long-term interests in fighting against great power diplomacy.
Các nước trung bình và nhỏ phải phối hợp cùng nhau để thoát khỏi mọi thủ đoạn gây sức ép về chính trị, các thủ đoạn mua chuộc, chia rẽ để trị của các thế lực cường quyền. Nếu chỉ chăm lợi ích riêng của mình, cái nhà hàng xóm bình chân như vậy thì trước sau cũng sẽ bị nó đè bẹp.
Small and medium countries must cooperate in dealing with great power strategy to avoid the political pressure and division tactics from the sanguinistic forces. Historic lessons have shown that if those countries just take care of their own interests, that we easily refer as stay quiet as neighbor house is in fire, these countries could be harmed sooner or later.
Nếu các nước trong khối ASEAN mà nhận thức được điều đó và thống nhất hành động với nhau thì không dễ gì Trung Quốc thực hiện được cái tham vọng Biển Đông của mình.
We believe that if ASEAN countries can reach a joint perception, it's no easy for China to use its diplomacy.
Điểm thứ tư nữa đấy là các phương tiện thông tin đại chúng có một vai trò đặc biệt quan trọng trong việc vạch trần cái chính sách cường quyền mà đang được áp dụng và bị che đậy, bị xuyên tạc bởi cái hệ thống truyền thông của các nước đó.
The fourth, the media must play more active role in uncovering the deceitful propaganda tactics by arrogant great power forces. For instance, the Chinese media has flooded the world with wrong, distorted information to deflect the international community from what is the truth in the maritime Asia.
Tôi sẽ không nói một điều gì có tính chất là đặc biệt mới nếu nói rằng là rất nhiều người dân Trung Quốc không được thông tin một cách chính xác đầy đủ về Biển Đông.
I won't say any new thing, but we understand that many Chinese people do not have informed correct information about South China Sea.
Trong vấn đề này thì lực lượng trí thức của các dân tộc có một vai trò rất quan trọng. Nó phải có trách nhiệm vạch rõ những sai lầm trong chính sách của các cái chính phủ cường quyền này, đồng thời làm cho nhân dân hiểu rõ thế nào là đúng sai và có một thái độ đúng trong cái việc ủng hộ hoặc phản đối chính sách cường quyền đó.
So I do believe that the elite group in this.
Chị ơi, chị.
Bên đồng có ý kiến một chút.
Không nghe được à?
Nghe được. Nghe được. You want to say something, Dr.
We're running out of time here, and I want to wrap up our discussion.
Okay.
Based on the analysis we had of World War I, and back here and ask some of our other.
Tức là đang hỏi bác sĩ mua sau đấy tới đây.
Considering now what we've heard from Vietnam, any thoughts, Suzanne, Ezra, on this?
I'll wait till I have it.
Anybody else who wants to comment? Maybe one of you three folks on how we might apply these lessons to the Pacific, especially given the comments we've had in Vietnam, which obviously reflect tough feelings about China's role. So what do you think?
Well, I think the major thing is again not to apply these World War I lessons literally.
Excuse me, sorry. Can we speak from Japan?
Yeah.
Not right now. Let's hold it for a second.
Well, when Prime Minister Abe raised the issue of 1914 at Davos last January, created quite a stir. I'm not sure it helped. I think that we ought to be careful to ask what are the things we can be doing for stability in East Asia now, and avoid too much of these historical metaphors and analogies, which are often leading us astray.
Particularly since it's a very different East Asia from
Right.
the one that was around in 1914. Dick, a comment?
No, I would defer to the Japanese. I mean, I have a comment that I can make.
We'll go back to them.
Well, I'd like to agree very strongly with one thing that our Vietnamese interlocutor said, which goes to the flow of information. And the Chinese and now the Russians, we see, are engaged in a systematic program of disinformation. More subtle in the case of China than in the case of Russia, but a systematic effort to exclude, insofar as possible in today's world, points that are relevant. So, for example, Chinese, except those who study it at university, do not know the Southeast Asian case for their claims to the islands, or the Japanese case to the Senkakus. So that the Chinese government has a program of tilting, let's put it that way, tilting the information that reaches the general Chinese public, not scholars. And of course, it's always possible to learn things on the internet, but you require a certain degree of skill to do that. I think that high school textbooks, to start with that point, and more generally information, are a legitimate area of foreign policy, a very important part of foreign policy in today's world. I just want to pick up that thing.
Because I'm not sure that the media generally in any country doesn't do a certain amount of tilting.
Oh, they do. They do a lot of tilting, but I'm not sure the tilting is systematic in, say, the British. If you read everything, I mean, enough material is available. That material is not available in Chinese in China.
Okay, well, we've pretty much come up to time in terms of this early discussion. I want to thank our discussants. They're not leaving us. They're going to be with us. I get a sense, Dick, here that what our friends Joe and Dick are saying is beware of analogies that may be not particularly relevant. And
they may actually be wrong. It's worse than being irrelevant. They may be wrong.
They may be wrong. But some interesting lessons to think about, it seems to me, as we move through our discussion. I want to turn now, before we go to our Japanese friends, to Esper Vogel and to Suzanne Ogden, and ask each of them for a comment or two on what you've heard, and more specifically, how we approach this question of creating a framework for peace and security.
Well, you had originally asked me to sort of set out a broad picture of the stage. Would
Let's
you like
have,
to do that
let's
now?
have it, yeah.
I think the best way to think about the overall situation in Asia is that we're in a very gradual transition now from a world that has been dominated by the United States and provided security and economic vitality to the region, where each country felt that if it made investments, they would be secure. And the dominance of the United States in that part of the world and the willingness of the United States to have international rules, to share technology, to share information, to open its universities, has provided a tremendous opportunity for dynamism. We have a new age of uncertainty that's created primarily by the fact that China is much stronger and may surpass the United States in overall economic output within a decade or so. And China's purposes are somewhat uncertain to the rest of the world. They advocate pursuing peaceful policy, but particularly the uncertainty centers around the question of territorial claims right now, because a lot of issues that were not settled historically are now, that all countries are getting very active in the Western Pacific, now a great issue. And the question is whether we can find some way to manage those different territorial claims. And the problem is that China has historical claims which would not probably go very well in the International Court of Justice. And therefore they are reluctant to take the case to the International Court of Justice. And there are people who worry that if China gets stronger, that will be much greater risk, and they may use force as a way of becoming strong. The United States' basic approach in this new uncertain era is to reassure its allies. We are there to stay. We will be loyal to our countries. The word pivot was used that had some unfortunate consequences because some Chinese thought that meant that we were just using military force to try to block the Chinese.
Some Americans too, I might add.
Some Americans also thought that was not the best terminology. But I think what the intent was to provide security that even though we are trying to pull out of Iraq and Afghanistan in a very major way, the United States has long-term interests in the Western Pacific. That's very vital to our future, and we will remain in that area. And the policy ever since Nixon went to China, the United States, is to engage in China, but to be prepared in case of emergency. The problem is that that's a very difficult balance to maintain. And within the United States, there are many different voices. There are voices of the media who want to turn it into a race between China and the United States. There are voices at the Pentagon who worry about the next budget and need an enemy in order to justify greater budgets. And then there are various other voices. And the problem for the president is to try to provide an overall good engagement with China and get enough discussions with all these other countries. The Chinese have a similar problem. They enunciate the desire for peace, and yet there are a lot of Chinese military who feel that China's been taken advantage of historically. And finally, we're going to be strong enough. We can do things. We have economic leverage. And to have the wisdom to manage that whole process is very difficult, especially now that China is entering a period of slow growth rate. Korea has been, in a way, at the fulcrum of Asian conflicts for over a century. It was the Sino-Japanese War over there, and it was the U.S.-Russia war was there. And now Korea has the long-term problem of trying to balance the security relations with the United States with closer economic relations with China, and to manage a very strong anti-Japanese sentiment from history with getting along with Japan. In the case of North Korea, you have an impossible situation that there's no easy solution. You have a country that's so small and so outdated and so worried that if they open up, they will be flooded by rich business people, South Korea and Japan and other places, that would overwhelm them, and they therefore are afraid to open. They're afraid to have real discussions, and the only thing they have is the atomic bomb, and it's going to create a lot of problems as they develop their weapons system. So, in short, I think we're going to have a lot of countries, small countries, that will turn to the United States as China gets tougher and want security. And one of the problems for the United States is to provide that security without making it into a risk for China over-responding and conflict. And I have broad suggestions for how to approach things. One is that
because that is the issue, isn't it?
It is. It's very central of how to manage that process. One is that the countries there try to avoid provocative statements. I think the visit of Abe to the Yasuni shrine would be considered provocative. Some of the Chinese use of military force is provocative. And I think, secondly, they have to deal with the broad historical issues of understanding to provide a framework so that the countries have better understanding, accurate picture, fair, open-minded picture of the history. Maybe I'd add a third, and it takes a lot of active diplomacy and guidance from very top leaders to manage this very difficult process.
Suzanne.
Just a quick comment, maybe trying to understand Beijing's view on this. I think from China's perspective, we have these bases basically surrounding China. They were originally put there during the Cold War as part of our fight against the spread of communism. It must feel to China the way it would feel if there were a Soviet base in Cuba, which we weren't very happy about, or if today the Chinese were to have put a base in Central America. We are very close to China with our bases, and so I think that China, now that it has more power, would sort of like this situation to stop, where they feel surrounded by U.S. bases that have long been there for theoretically a different purpose during the Cold War, the containment of communism. The only other thing I would say is that historical claims are very dangerous because which historical claims, how far back do you go? If we go back to the Mexican-American War in the 1850s and say that's Mexico's historical claim, they'd have about a claim to something like 1/3 to 25% of the United States territory. So the question, and of course we could always go back in Europe to an earlier period and recidivism. So I think that's always a problem. What part of it? A 9-dash line? Well, whoever accepted that, and why should anybody accept that time in history as the defining moment for who owns what territory?
Dick, I want to turn to you before we go back out and talk with our friends from Japan. Ezra mentioned the International Court of Justice as a possible forum to resolve these issues. But I have been hearing a lot from the United States, among others, about the importance of doing that. Instead, it's all about alliances, which is, Suzanne points out, really go back to the Cold War. I mean, if this is going to be resolved, doesn't there have to be some kind of serious international institutional framework within which to do this? Otherwise, we're kind of left with a collection of alliances, pressures. When the Chinese president goes to South Korea, it's immediately interpreted by the American media as being an effort to destroy our alliance with South Korea. I thought it was a pretty good signal to the North Koreans that the Chinese are taking the South Koreans quite seriously. In any event, talk about this international framework that is out there but doesn't seem to be
functioning
very effectively, and neither the United States nor a lot of other people, with the possible exception of the Philippines, I guess, seriously talking about using it.
Right. I think the idea of going to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, for some of these claims is a very good one, but in order to have that effective, both parties have to agree. We have tried to get the Japanese to do it Joe, you personally intervened on that, and they're not willing to do it. And I don't think the Chinese are willing to do it either. So I think it's very much of a background kind of thing, the role of the ICJ.
But let me interrupt for a second. Why would the Japanese be interested in doing this?
Well, the Japanese, we should ask Ambassador Fujisaki, who can really speak the part. The Japanese who said they would be willing with Korea over what the Japanese called Takeshima, the Koreans called Dokdo Island, to the ICJ. But in that case, the Koreans are in possession of the islands. On the Senkakus, the Japanese have said there's not a dispute. It's our sovereignty. Why should we go to the ICJ?
Right.
And but in that case, Japan's in possession. So the willingness to go to the court or not is often based on that cliche that possession is nine-tenths of law.
Well, I'd just like to make one comment about whether or not we can get a grouping in Asia that will deal effectively with these problems. Remember, during the 1950s and 60s, in Europe, we did have a grouping that was very strong, that buttressed Western policy, and particularly American policy, gave rise to NATO. And there was never anything like that in Asia. And is there likely to be anything like that? I don't think so, at least not in the short run. The differences within the Asians, beside China, are just as great as the difference between them and China.
Can I add something to here? The discussion?
Yeah, sure, by all means.
Yeah.
I think it was a very enlightening discussion on World War I. Just 2 points. I think the difference is also that today the world is with rules when there were no rules 100 years ago. And some countries are now violating international laws and regulations. That's point one. Point two, of course, you know, the nuclear deterrence. The existence of that makes a big difference. I think that war should be avoided, as many of you have said. But two things have to be kept in mind. One is that some countries may not think that way and use force not as only a deterrence, but a little bit more with little hesitation. And the second point is that we should also keep in mind the lesson of World War II, the Munich conference as well. As for our relations with China, I think three things are important from our side. No compromise, no taken off guard, and not to provocate. No provocation from our side. And I think China has a lot of frustration in the country, so they may need something as well, but as long as US is trustworthy, I think Japanese in general would not think that we have to really change the policy. As for ICJ, as you have rightly said, we think that this has been our land all the way, and US has returned this to us after Okinawa reversion. There's no reason why we have to negotiate this on that. And on Chinese military, one thing we have to say is that we often discuss, Japanese or Americans say that Chinese military needs a bit more transparency. This is true, but that's not the real issue. What the real issue is the size, sheer size of the military. It's growing, rapidity in growing, and I think we have to sometimes be very clear on that, not only saying the very diplomatic word of transparency. Thank you very much for taking time.
Ambassador, but let me ask you this. There's obviously a dispute about these islands. And generally speaking, in our societies, at least domestically, if there's a dispute, you go to court. You don't say, well, I'm there, we reject the other side's claim, and we're not going to be willing to submit it to a court of law. Why wouldn't Japan be willing to do that? I mean, why shouldn't, well, for that matter, any other country, say, yeah, we'll go to court and let the International Court of Justice decide this? I mean, isn't that the way these days that in civil society we try to resolve these disputes? You just don't say, hey, we're there, so we're not going to go to court. Why wouldn't Japan or any other country want to do that?
I don't know if that attitude is going to be taken by U.S. government, if U.S. Ireland, which has been in the United States for many years, is just surrounded by some other countries' ships and said that they are their territory. Would you directly go to the international court, or would you say that this has been our land, there's nothing to be disputed? I think maybe I'm wrong, but my hunch, U.S. will not say that, hey, let's discuss this. I think you will say this is our land. I think that's the same as that.
Yeah, but that's the same attitude. If you're going to take that attitude generally, then I don't know how we resolve this. I mean, speaking as an American, I mean, if there were American territory that some other country thought was theirs, I mean, personally, I wouldn't have a problem with the Court of Justice.
Now, Governor, this is JD. I'd like to respond when you have a chance.
It's an interesting question. I don't think it's going to happen.
No, but I mean, there is a real question of legality there.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Okay.
Governor, this is JD Vindenagel. I'm actually in Ho Chi Minh City with Tuan. I would like to react to several things that have been said. I agree with Joe and others who have said that you may draw the wrong lessons from history if you take the wrong analogies. But there are several things that have come out of the history that are very important that we know. One is that in World War I, there were several miscalculations. The miscalculations were motivated by nationalism and other issues that we really didn't all understand. And there was no place, in the case that you just mentioned about the Senkakus and the South China Seas, there's no place that others recognize as the legitimate way to resolve these issues. There's no court. If no one will recognize the court, or all sides won't recognize the court, that's not possible. So we end up, I say this perhaps reluctantly in this group, but we end up with the Bob Kagan and Mearsheimer concern about great power politics played without rules, and with the chance of conflict between the United States and China, along with the smaller countries who would like us to play a role, comes back to the United States role. Our role really should be one that you've heard here, that we played a stabilizing role in the Cold War, and that after the Cold War we remain to have great interest there. And what should we do but try to clarify what the interests are, what the narratives are of these countries, so that we can have some basis for making some judgments. There isn't any other way for the United States to play. There are the Asia Summit, and there are ASEAN and the ASEAN Plus organizations that provide a place for us to have these conversations. But it is what you all have done here starting this forum is create a way for understanding, for shared narratives, and for avoiding miscalculations that then lead us to some way to make decisions. I agree with Ambassador Fujisaki, who's note that for them, that for China, their policy of no competition, no surprise, no provocation, those are good rules. It would be good if that narrative were shared with the Chinese, and we could play a role perhaps in facilitating it. We all, I think, agree that war should be avoided, but we're not headed that way. The South China Seas has enough conflict and enough interest involved that we will have conflict unless we can find some way to understand and calculate what I think is probably the most important force here, and that is nationalism. But nationalism is not limited to China, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, and now we see in international order what Putin has done in pursuing ethnic nationalism with the use of force is undermined the Helsinki Accords of not changing borders except through peaceful means. He's using ethnic, not quite ethnic cleansing, but ethnic moves to create conflict. these are the things that we have in this forum that you've created here, a way to understand what's happening, to share narratives, and to avoid miscalculation. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Ambassador. Comments from Joe?
Well, I think JD makes a number of very good points. I think the American presence in East Asia after the Cold War meant that there was a stabilizing factor, and I remember talking to Chinese officials one point in which they said that while they objected to bases outside of countries, they made exceptions for historical reasons, meaning Japan and the U.S. relationship with Japan. So I think it's actually the U.S. role maintaining the U.S.-Japan alliance is a stabilizing factor. Now, I think the harder question is, what do you do with places where we don't have alliances? And
Like Vietnam.
Like
for
Vietnam, yeah.
Dick?
Yes. Oh, which Dick?
Either one.
Okay. I'd just like to say that I think we're not going to get a single overarching regional organization that will settle these problems. I think most of this will depend upon individual relationships between countries that are close to the United States and the United States. There is not going to be a Pacific Pact analogous to the Atlantic Pact, but I think there can be closer relationships with the United States, and Vietnam obviously is a key case where I think relationships should be closer than they have been. Obviously, Vietnam is in the front line in dealing with Chinese territorial claims. I don't think it should be in the front line alone. I'm not suggesting a formal alliance between the United States and Vietnam, but I am suggesting that in terms of understandings of Vietnam's policy, the United States should speak out very clearly that is concerned about these territorial issues that are unresolved. And even though the drilling rig has left, it will probably be back. And will that be something that Vietnam can handle entirely by itself? I think the answer is not clear. So I think there is going to be, over time, a relationship of important East Asian powers, like Vietnam, like Korea, like Japan, with the United States to help them deal individually with the problems that they face with China. And I think we should encourage that and recognize that a regional organization is not going to emerge.
But Dick, doesn't that reinforce the view that China may have about all of this? Like, I mean, if this is about the United States making a bunch or sustaining a bunch of alliances, which are clearly designed to constrain China, aren't you just exacerbating the problem? I mean, what's wrong with trying to work?
Everything depends on how you handle your alliances. I mean, the real problem in 1914 is, if your ally was on one side, you went with him no matter what. Take Bismarck. Bismarck had two allies that had differences with one another. He was very careful not to side forcibly with one particular party as against the other. Insisted on supporting both sides and not allowing conflict between them. Why can't we do that vis-a-vis Japan and China, vis-a-vis Vietnam and China, where you have close relationships with both sides, but you're not going to come down just supporting one side? I mean, I think that is what we need to do. We can't get rid of alliances. Those are crucial. But you have to handle them in a way that is more balanced than we've handled them up to now.
I would take issue with Susan's observation. For anyone who is historically minded, which in general Americans are not, but Chinese are, these bases had their origin independent of China. Japan, including Okinawa, Korea, these are not key to China. They are historic in origin. Question is whether they've served their purpose, and we should close them down, and we need to ask what signals that would send if we did that. The only new base we have in that part of the world is in Darwin, Australia. We've had an alliance with Australia for a long time, but the only new base, and if you look at a map, Darwin is very, very, very far from China. Very far from China. Only on a world map does it look close to China. So if the Chinese are interpreting these bases as being anti-Chinese in origin, that is itself a deliberate, I say deliberate, it's inadvertent, I'm sure in the case of many Chinese, distortion of history. It is, and we should make that point and ask them straightforwardly, would you like us to close them down? And this has to be done in track 2, not in official channels. Would you like us to close them down, and what are the consequences of that? And by the way, for your own military forces, as the point that was made, China has the largest military forces in the world by a large measure, if you count by manpower. And if you leave aside the United States, they have the largest budget for military forces.
You don't think we'd be trouble if the Chinese sent 2,500 Marines to Venezuela?
Depends on what they were going to do there, but if they were serving a good purpose, I don't, actually. I've never thought that South America is an American backyard. That's a misconception on the American part.
I'm sorry.
Up to the map.
Hello.
Can I say a word about the alliance, as following up with what Joe and I said? I think most of the people in Asia, maybe except for North Koreans and Chinese, would continue to look upon U.S. as a stabilizing force, and a lot of us would not really spell it out, maybe, but in reality, they think that, don't be shy, Americans, we need you there. I'm not trying to be making some propaganda, but really, this is the underlying current there. And some people may say that, hey, that it's changing, but I think it's still not yet. So please keep that in mind.
I want to, the role of the Asian veterans is to point out how complex things are. So I think some of the things about, say, not having regional organizations, we have thousands of regional organizations, and they overlap. Right. And we have to work with all kinds of, we have the Southeast Asian organization who provides the reform question, we have APEC, we have BEAD, and Japan, the United States.
None of them are like NATO.
There's no single dominant organization, but they all play a role. And so to think we tell somebody so-and-so, the roots now are so complex, and the United States and China have so many interlocking arrangements of all kinds of areas, and with Japan. So to say that we should pull up or tell somebody something, it's not that simple. They're broad, complex, deep relationships, and the problem is trying to manage those in such a way that we can work with China in a positive way for dealing with all these difficulties and for taking account all these complexities, and yet say, if push comes to shove, we will back our ally, and then that will make it very clear that it's wise to avoid those risks. So it's very complex.
Suzanne.
Chairman, may I?
Hold on just a second. Hold on a second. We'll be back to Susanna.
I would have to dispute what Dick Cooper said. Those bases, the more than 100 bases that we established during the Cold War, they were aimed at containing communism in the Soviet Union and China. There's no question. They weren't there for some other reason. So we were in Taiwan, the Quemoy. There was a base there.
We're out of those places now.
Well, that's the one.
You were talking about contemporary bases today.
Right. So we still
so
have.
It's Okinawa, it's Guam, it's Japan, it's South Korea, and now Darwin.
Right.
We're out of the Philippines. We're out of Taiwan. We're
back in the Philippines.
No, we aren't.
We were only out of the Philippines.
We may be.
We were only out of the Philippines because we were kicked out.
No, we are out because of the volcano.
I want to hear what David has to say.
Yes, go ahead.
Chairman, may I? David Warren, former British ambassador to Japan, talking from London. Thank you for letting me join you today. I have to say, looking at this from a Japanese perspective, the problem is that Japan feels that much of the rest of the world sees China as a status quo power, but Japan does not see China in those terms.
Vietnam,
And this, of course, presents us with a major problem in terms of our crafting a narrative for managing these security issues in East Asia without, at the same time, crafting a narrative which is about containment of China. And the parallels with the 40s and 50s are maybe not very helpful there, because that was a narrative about containment of Soviet Russia. I have to say, though I'm seeing this from a Japanese perspective, I really cannot see an alternative in the absence of any international institutional framework which allows these toxic territorial issues to be discussed, to the United States continuing to play the role that they have played as Japan's ally and as guarantor of regional stability in Northeast Asia. There doesn't seem to me to be an alternative to that. I think it would be much easier for us to see a way through some of these problems if the Japanese government moved away from the position which Ambassador Fujisaki has explained very clearly, of denying that this is a dispute which can be taken to the International Court of Justice. I think that Japan would be in a much stronger position, or at least, let me say, it would be much easier for Japan to evade Chinese attempts to manipulate Japan's position if Japan were to say to China, we will see you in court. Now, that might present China with difficulty, but in the absence of an institutional framework which allows these issues to be discussed, we are inevitably going to find ourselves moving back into great power diplomacy, because it will be alliances that dictate who does what and who exercises power. I'm not a historian. There are some very distinguished historians on the panel and around the world discussing this today, so I don't myself know quite what conclusions we draw from looking back 100 years. But it was clear from the diplomatic failures in 1914, diplomatic and military failures, that there was profound misunderstanding of each other's strengths, capabilities and intentions. And there are also historians who argue quite strongly that there was, on the part of individual parties to the dispute, a reluctance to accept that other parties had rights which had to be respected. Christopher Clark, in his book Sleepwalkers, makes a powerful and provocative argument that that applies very much in terms of Russia's attitude towards Austro-Hungary's rights to seek restitution from Serbia. I'm not going to argue the pros and cons of those historical cases, but it is important, I think, in this instance, that we recognize that from a Japanese perspective, there is a proximate threat in Northeast Asia, and we have to find a way of resolving that threat without tipping ourselves over into this competitive great power diplomacy which so failed us a century ago.
Mike, I think to try
I just wanted to say a few words because this was very important. When you were there in Tokyo 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I think there was frustration on the Japanese side that rest of the people don't think China is a status quo power, Japan not. However, I think the situation may be changing a bit with Vietnam, Philippines, and many others thinking that, hey, which is status quo? I think all in all, Japan has been quite a status quo and has been working with the United States and all others, ASEAN, for so many years. Now, one thing I want to add is the time element. When you are negotiating with some countries, which leaders do not change for 10 years, which there's no election and regime would go on for 20 years, 30 years, when you try to rush to make a deal, you would be often on disadvantageous position. And we have to always keep in mind, if this is the right timing to make something of international institution, or is it really, do we have to endure some more? And I think it may not be the right timing to try to go to make some deal. We have to get the understanding of international society, as you have rightly said, and I think we are getting that more and more, thanks maybe not only to our effort, but the effort of the other side, if I may say. So we hope that the time will come that, as you said, international institution should be established or considered. I hope that this day will come soon. We'll be very patient in waiting, and that is exactly what I said about no compromise, no provocation, and no taken off guard. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Ambassador.
Okay, Governor, may I say a few words, please, from Ho Chi Minh City?
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and we're going to have to close this down. But we're going to have another conference. We will have two more, first of which will be in September, and I hope we can invite all of you to be a part of this. I think you've all set the stage, and Ezra, I'd like you to kind of wrap up on this. I think we've kind of set the stage for our next meeting here. And I want to thank all of you for being a part of this. Ezra, some closing words before we
I was
wrap
going
up?
to make a comment about to try to understand Japan. You have in what they're doing, and to add to what Ambassador Fujisaki and David Warren said, is that they use the example of Finland. What happened to Finland in the Soviet Union? And I think the reason they're not rushing to agreements is to make it clear that they're not going to be pushed around. And they want to make it clear that they are a strong country. And
They meaning who?
Japan,
Okay.
Japanese government. And therefore, my view is that if it were taken to court, they would be happy to have it done that way. But I think as a general stance, they have to do things to show that they're not just going to give and so forth, to set the stage for China. And so I think that's very important. I think the big issue is all these smaller powers of Asia, smaller than China and the United States, will be turning to the United States.
Yes.
And how we can manage that process to give them reassurance. At the same time, we are not aggressive to China.
Right.
In the context of engagement and working with China, and either or black and white. That's going to be the challenge that our group needs to wrestle with.
And I would add, if I may, Ezra, to that, and the challenge of what? Creating some kind of international framework or institution where, over the long term, these issues can be resolved.
I think it's not a single
but
organ. I think it's not a single organization. It's a
Maybe not.
complex web,
yeah.
and it's managing that very complex.
maybe so. Well, I think this sets us up for a very good discussion in September. And I want to thank all of you for being part of this. Twan, a special thank you to you, as always, for bringing us all together in the first place. And
do buy the book.
And do buy the book, yes. And we look forward to involving you and many others in September. But I think we have the basis for a good, solid discussion, and want to thank all of you for being a part of this. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well done. When does the book publish?
Well,